My name is Ellie Gregory, and I'm from Rogue River, Oregon, and I'm an Angora Goat breeder. I've had Angoras for 15 years now. I'm a retired veterinarian, so I really love these animals. Obviously, this is something that I can do, and I'm not a spring chicken. I'm in my mid-70s, and I love these animals because it's one that I could do, and I hope to be doing it for 10 or 15 or 20 years more. So, they're animals that as long as you're healthy, there's no reason why you can't work with them. Today we're going to demonstrate hoof trimming and talk a little bit about the parts of the hoof. What you'll need to do a good job hoof trimming is a decent pair of hoof trimmers that are sharp, and this type of trimmer is what I like to use. They have hoof rasps and heavier trimmers which may be useful in older bucks, especially where the hoofs can get quite tough. A rasp is actually like a file that you can file down the hoof, whereas clippers are like cutting your fingernails. The cheapest option would be a good pair of these because they last a long time. You can get them resharpened, and they're the most versatile of all the tools to do the hoofs. You can buy them online at pretty much any sheep and goat supply. At most of the fiber fairs and animal fairs, there may be vendors that are selling, equipment, and they usually run somewhere between $15 and $25. Some people use some Fiskars products that were originally intended for plant cutting. I like these because they're sturdy enough to do 90% of the hooves that I need to deal with. The Fiskars are usually lighter. They're good for kid hooves, but they may not be tough enough to do the job on an older goat. Really dry, hot weather will make them very tough and difficult to trim. Ideally, we would want to trim them about every 8 weeks. Oftentimes, in large herds, they may not get trimmed until they are brought in for shearing, and that might be twice a year. Ideally, you'd want to do them at least 4 times a year, I would say. If I'm putting them on the stand, it's a good time to groom them and also get their feet in good shape for the show. If they're on hard surfaces like concrete or have a lot, like a rocky environment that helps to wear the hooves, that will make them need trimming less often. The soft environments are the ones that are going to allow that hoof to grow long. Grass, soft dirt, anything that the hoof can sink into rather than actually abrade. It depends on what you've got out there, because a lot, even of the Midwest, will have hard pan, which can also add, it's like almost flat areas of rock in their pastures that if the animals are spending time on those, or even if they have mounds of boulders and things that they can be goats on and climb up on, those are all going to help with hoof control. But it just depends on your specific micro environment. We have concrete aprons in front of our barn and in front of our feeders, and they have to go across those every day, so that tends to help keep them a little bit better than if we didn't have that. For the ideal Angora goat facility, I would recommend there be some areas that they have to access daily that may be either concrete or packed gravel, something that would give them some hoof wear. It also, in our experience, in front of the barn and in front of the feeders, it tends to cut down on the amount of mud that they have to deal with as well. So it kind of does a dual purpose to have concrete aprons in front of the barn and in front of the feeders for us. We also have things that they can climb on. We have, a boulder pillar or pile that they like to play King of the Mountain on and things like that. That also helps with keeping the feet in better condition, but that's not going to eliminate hoof trimming altogether. You do still need to pay attention to those hooves. The main thing you worry about with not trimming hooves is the possibility of developing hoof rot or infectious disease within the hoof and foot itself. It also, as they overgrow, they cause stress on the ligaments of the pastern and can change the way the animal stands and is able to move about. So the things you want to prevent are changes in the leg that make it less functional and changes in the health of the foot itself. Yeah, on occasion you'll see goats that have been on a fairly soft substrate that have hooves that grow out and look like skis almost. They'll be walking back on their heels, and the whole front of the hoof will be inches longer, sometimes 4 or 5 inches longer than it should be, as those animals try to compensate for that overgrowth by setting back on the heels. It could cause the animal to stand in a way that doesn't show it off to its best advantage. You could be down in the pasterns because of it. They could be just uncomfortably trying to shift on hooves that are way too long. And they just don't stand as well as they should in the show ring. So in the show ring, it's a pretty thing, but in real life, it's a functional thing. Now we're going to go over the parts of the hoof. And what we have here are the corona is where the hoof grows from, which is up here, similar to the cuticle on people. And then you've got the hoof wall itself that comes down, and then the sole of the foot is inside here. And it's soft, and you can actually, if you trim too far in, you can make that bleed for the foot. This one is only not terribly overgrown, but it certainly could use a bit of a trim here. So Angora goats have 2 separate hooves, and they do have a gland up in here, so you might want to check that to make sure that it's in good shape too. Sometimes they'll get a foxtail up in there or something, and you'll see a big lumpy, pussy, wet sort of area in there. This is the normal stuff that comes out of the gland, and that you can't really see. This one is very healthy, and you really can't see the gland up in there. But so if you see a lump in there, you probably have an infected gland. This is the toe, and that's usually the area that gets the longest, so that when you have an overgrown hoof, what you'll want to accomplish ideally is to have it parallel with the corona up here. So this hoof could be trimmed this way along the toe. This is the heel, and usually you want to see this heel. Generally the heels are not as overworn as the toe, or as overgrown as the toes. So that's a good place to look and see if you've got a good length already, and then just try to straighten the hoof out to that. Pretty much from about here, there's not much. So you can see this nice shiny area here is soft, healthy heel. So that's already as far down as it wants to be. So you'd remove just a little bit of this heel here and come along about like this on this line to remove this excess toe. And then you would do the same to even it up on the inside here. Okay, these are the rudimentary toes that are not being used in the hoof. They form these little dew claws, and they can overgrow a little bit, and you can actually, they're like a heavy callus, so you can actually trim some of that off. Some of them will actually grow out and look like these big horns coming off the foot, and those do need to be trimmed back a little bit. These could be trimmed a little, but again, there's living tissue in here and you don't want to go too far. But we could probably take this much off of this one, maybe a 1/4 inch here, and on this one about the same. All right, so we're going to trim these hooves right now. We'll start with these little slightly long dew claws and just take off these little points here. And you can see that it's all just kind of dry, crusty material. So you can trim that back until you're starting to see the shiny part of the goat where the animal actually lives. So that's just about where we want to be here, because we're seeing the dry part flaking off, and we're getting to a more skin-like looking area down under there. You can see. So that one looks pretty good. Take a bit off of this one. See, there's where the callus is starting to become fresh, and that's about as far in as you want to go on a callus, a dew cloth, so that you're not causing the goat any discomfort there. And these, unless they get excessively long, usually don't really need to be trimmed, but they do look a lot nicer and make it a lot easier to hold the hoof while you're trimming if you've got ones that are kind of sharp. Okay, now on the hoof itself, again, this is normal heel sole here. So we'll try to take off a little bit off of the edge there, and then we'll just come down. You're all right, sweetheart. We'll try to just come down and bring that extra long part of this hoof off to the toe. And when it's pink like that, you know you're as far as you want to go. And then you can come back and do this other side over here. Sorry, sweetie, come on. And just even it up. Pretty much so that you've got a nice flat surface there. And so that is an adequate job. What I've done is removed the excessive hoof that was overlapping on this side, and then removed some of the inside here to flatten the hoof out. Might be able to take just a little bit more off here. And you know, it's best to go, unless you know your animals really well, go just a little at a time. You don't want to get too deep, because you will get bleeding tissue if you go too deep. But this looks pretty adequate to me, and I think that side of the hoof would serve this goat well until she needs it again. We could take just a little bit more off here. But again, you don't want to get too vigorous and wind up with a bloody foot if you can help it. So that looks pretty decent. We'll go over and do the other side now just the same. Take this little ridge off. And then sometimes it helps to come from different angles on these guys, especially where they've got a little curve in this part. The stand is nice, especially if you're doing it by yourself, because the goat really can't, you know, be fighting too much and going anywhere while you're trying to, you know, get these hooves done. You're not chasing it all over the pasture trying to do it. There are some other methods that we'll try to give you a little demonstration on later, on ways you can do it without a stand. But for the most part, come on, sweetheart. For the most part, I prefer to do it on a stand. You're all right, come on. But again, this one looks like it's pretty well trimmed now. She's getting tired of me holding it up. We can actually take just a little bit more off the toe here. I know you're getting tired of this. And sometimes if you have a condition, which we might be able to see a little better on a couple other goats, called seedy toe, where you get some dry tissue down in here, you can actually snip that little tip of the toe off. But this one has got a healthy toe, so there's no reason to do that. And doing it may actually cause some bleeding. So I think we've got a fairly decently trimmed hoof here now. Even the best of us will wind up trimming a goat too short, and you'll see some blood. If it's just oozing, you really don't need to do a whole lot. There are products like Quick Stop that you can use if it's bleeding a little bit more, but for the most part, they'll do okay even if they've got, unless you've got an artery spurting or something like that. You generally don't have to bandage, but in a case like that, if you do have an artery spurting, and that actually can happen sometimes, then a bandage for a day or two may be appropriate. A vet wrap bandage with maybe some antibiotic ointment on the foot itself. Don't do it too tight because you can, and be sure to remove it daily. But just pretty much any kind of something just to keep it clean while the wound is healing over, and they heal quite fast. Cornstarch, flour, sometimes even just a piece of their mohair packed in there will help to clot it and make it so that it will stop bleeding quicker. And obviously not stressing the animal so that they don't get high blood pressure. So if you cut a foot, don't try to chase it down to do anything about it. You're better off letting the animal rest and get over it.
So if you cut one and you were only one hoof in, would you recommend just quitting for the day?
Not necessarily. What I would usually do is probably pack it with some mohair, or use the Quick Stop or whatever you have to help to clot it, and stand it on that foot, and then go ahead and do the others, so that you can be done for the day and the animal can settle down and drop its blood pressure and start the healing process. All right, back foot is a little bit more tricky in that, come here, sweetheart, in that the hoof is somewhat differently configured. Come here, baby. Let's do this here, shall we? Come here. Generally, you don't have as much to come off of the back feet as you do on the front. All right, Pumpkin, let's go here. So you want to be a little more careful, a little more conservative on your trim. Again, our heels are done well here. Do you want to just stand next to her hip there? It always helps to have somebody with you when you're doing things to calm the jumpy goat. But this is something you can do on your own. But again, you want to be pretty conservative. These hoofs are usually not as long as the front, so you want to just take off whatever's folded over, and then if you need to go a little bit farther, you can go down by degrees. Now see, we're already to pink after just a very tiny bit off of something that looked like it needed more trimming. So that's what you want to be aware of on back feet. They tend to be not as far overgrown as the front, and the best thing to do is to just remove the parts that are overlapping so that you don't wind up with a bloody hoof. One thing people don't realize is that 40% of the animal's weight is supported by the back feet and 60% by the front. So you generally have the heavier hoofs and the thicker hooves and the more rapidly growing hoofs on the front to support that extra weight. So, because the body is about the same front to back, but then you've got the head and neck on the front, which you don't have back here. So that looks pretty decent. And if you notice, we didn't have to take off near as much as we did on the front foot. So now that we've finished this hind foot, I find it's easiest to just reach over and do this other hind foot before we go to the other side of the animal. And again, you know, this one you just want to be conservative about, but you have a little better control on this opposite hind foot because you've actually got the rump held up under your arm here, and that seems to calm the animal somewhat for trimming this side. So I get 3 of them done on one side and then do the front on its side because it's hard to reach over the head and do a good job that way. So that's kind of a handy hint if you haven't done hooves before, is to go ahead and do both hind feet from your dominant side, whichever hand you like to use most for trimming, so that you can just tuck them under your arm there and get the job done. Oh, that's fairly good. So we've got a pretty nice even hoof. It's pretty, you can see that it's pretty much parallel top to bottom here. I don't know, maybe you can see it there better. Parallel. And you know, these hooves will probably be fine for 6 to 8 weeks before you'd want to have to do it again. There's the parallel lines. Okay, another way you can handle a goat that needs to have hooves done is on a halter up against a fence or something like that. So we've haltered this little girl. We're going to go ahead and I think we only have the front foot on the left to do yet, so I'm going to turn her around to that side, have it out. Sweetheart. I'm going to want her to be up against the fence and to tie her fairly close. Hang on to those for a minute. So come here, Pumpkin. Come here. Oh, that's a good girl. So just tie them up close so they don't have a lot of room to wiggle. And then you can use the fence to kind of support the back, the area that, so that you can kind of control her by just coming in now, and picking up the foot, just holding her against the fence like this, so that you can keep her still while you trim this foot. And then again, you just want to take off the part that's overlapping. That's a good girl. That's a good girl. And this is a way that you can actually confine the goat adequately to do hooves if you don't have a stand or a friend. And friends are always wonderful to have, because they can take care of anything that happens to come up that you weren't planning on anyway. But like I say, this will help to control her enough to get these hoofs done, and then you just switch her around to do the other side, so that you can just keep a hip into her to keep her up against the fence and get the hoof done. If I'm doing a big buck, this may not be an appropriate way to do when it weighs more than I do. So a stand would be the way to go. A wild kid that's going to be jumping around, if he's still small, there's another method we can show you that will help, as long as he's small enough to handle in your lap. But otherwise, again, a stand is the ideal go-to for trimming hooves. Okay, this one looks pretty decent now. Again, we've got the nice parallel hoof there. Yeah, ideally, you want it to look just like it was when he was born, or she was born. So you want it parallel right across. And in some cases, they have been out of trim for long enough that you may not be able to achieve that right away. But gradually, you'll be able to bring the hoof back into alignment. So this is an alternative to a stand for your average sized goat. All right, so trimming a kid in the lap if you don't have a stand, works for a while. I've got a back foot here. It's fairly overgrown, so we can take off the toe here a little bit at a time. And this one is in a fairly dry environment. You can see the seeded toe a little bit right here, where you can see we're already to nice healthy hoof there, but we've got a little patch of dry stuff here. We can just actually take that whole little piece off there and leave it like that. This is what you have to do when you've got a lot of kids and nobody to help you. So, no, we didn't do a whole lot of maintenance work in vet school. And we didn't do a whole lot of goats, to be quite honest. And that's why it's hard to find a good goat vet. People that, only have a few and have them very tractable by handling them a lot. With the fact that it seems like most of the people that are in the Angora Goat scene tend to be older women or women in general. And let's get that other foot up here. Okay, you're good. We'll let you have that one now. And so this is something that they're such a wonderful animal to work with, that a lot of these things can be done without help. And even though I have a husband, he's not that useful around the farm part, the animal part. So I wind up doing a lot of the maintenance myself on these animals. And because of that, having some techniques that make it possible to do as an individual, and as a not very strong and not very large individual, is important, and makes these guys an ideal choice for somebody who wants a few fiber animals and wants to give them good care, but doesn't have the facilities or the manpower that a lot of these other larger, less docile animals require in order to take proper care of them. So we've gotten both hind feet done now, and we can start working in the front. And sometimes this little girl is almost too big to do this with. If I get to this point, I can actually slip her butt down onto the ground and do her front feet this way. So she's still pretty well controlled, and doesn't, and this is not one of my tamest ones, so she is behaving very well for this process, and we're both quite happy about that. So that looks pretty decent on that hoof. And then we can finish her up with this last one, and she'll be ready to go back. Alright, she looks pretty decent there. And I think she's pretty much done. Okay, so that's doing a kid in your lap. Oh my gosh, that just moved it. Come on, get up. So I'll look at one of the older ones to see if we can find some of the other problems that we're talking about. These are my best buddies. This is my strawberry here. She's a love. She and I like each other.
We never talked about this, but can you tell us what it is and if it needs to be trimmed and when it might need to be trimmed?
Sometimes, I don't even remember what
Dew paw?
Okay. Okay. Thank you. What am I supposed to say now? Obviously, this is something that I can do, and I'm not a spring chicken.